In this next conversation, we're going to dive deeper into the importance of healthy soils. I'm excited to turn it over to our next moderator, James Deneen, who is an environmental reporter for New Scientist. He will be joined by Timothy Bowles, the Associate Professor of Agroecology and Sustainable Agriculture Systems at the University of California, Berkeley. Gerardo Menendez, a farmer and owner of Wild Kid Acres and the CEO of the Global Alliance of Latinos in Agriculture. Dr. Danielle Rath is an agricultural soil carbon scientist at NRDC. And Sara, thank you. And Sara Farley is the Vice President of the Food Initiative at the Rockefeller Foundation. Huge applause for them all, please. James, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks everyone for being here. So we're going to talk about soil, but before we get dirty, I thought I'd say some quick soil stats just to give us a sense of the importance of soil and also the scale of the problem. So, as many of you probably know, soil is the most biodiverse habitat on the planet, home to as many as 60% of all species. 1 gram of soil contains enough DNA that if you were to lay it all out in a row, it would extend around 1,000 miles. 1 gram. On carbon, by some estimates, soil currently stores as much as 9 times as much carbon as all above ground storage and could store substantially more. And yet, this immense and slowly accumulated resource is under threat. By one estimate, 16% of soils are at risk of eroding away within just 100 years. According to the UN FAO, a third of soils are already degraded, and that could rise to 90% by 2050 without big changes. So that's the situation. But just so we're all on the same page here, I thought it would be good to start with what is soil and what makes for healthy soil?
Well, I can go ahead and jump in. So, saying what is soil really depends on who you're talking to sometimes. So you could say it's the thin skin of the earth on which all life depends. You could say it is the literal foundation of our society. What makes soil healthy is that the main thing to think about is that it's alive, right? It's a living network, a living ecosystem. Like you said, one of the most biodiverse ones on the planet. And soil's capacity to function as that living network, to continue to support societies, plants, animals that depend on it, is really what makes healthy soil.
It seems like there might be an analogy to be made between human health and soil health.
Yeah.
When we were talking about that.
Yeah, right. So, I'm not a physician. I'll start with that. But I would argue that, our own health, if we think about it, is really a product of kind of 3 things, right? One thing we can't control who our parents were, what our genes are, for better or for worse, right? Sometimes we'd like to be able to change our parents. But the environment in which we live, which sometimes we also have limited control over, and how we take care of ourselves or don't take care of ourselves, right? And soil is similar, right? It has parents, it has rocks from which it formed. It formed in a particular environment, maybe at the bottom in a valley on the side of a hill. And then there's the way that we take actions to care for it or not. And it's those actions that are really mostly impacting the life in soil most acutely, right? We're not going to change the mineral makeup of soil very much, but our actions do impact the organisms that live there, that abundant biodiverse life, and also the amount of soil organic matter, all of the product, the relics of everything that was alive in soil. Right, and so those 3 things together, right? That's really makes for this metaphor of health in soil that is akin to our own health.
Do you want to also?
Yeah, so as a Latino farmer and representing a lot of Latino farmers around the world, soil is not just like something that we build on and basically extract from. To us, it's actually a family member, right? Like when we sit down at the dinner table with my family, my son is here today, we discuss what it means and how we're impacting our family member, the soil, right? Like we call it tierra or just the campo, like whatever we want to call it. It's a family member to us that we have to decide on, because at the end of the day, we're not going to be prosperous at all if our foundation, like he said, is getting destroyed every single movement we make. And just by observing it alone, you're affecting it. So for us, it's a family member, and it has to do with health, has to do with prosperity, has to do with everything. It also has to do with the way that we live. So
I think that gives a great sense of what it means for soil to be healthy. Sara, maybe you could talk about the state of the world's soil health today. what is the state of that health, and what's driving the unhealthy aspects?
Yeah. Well, I think the biggest culprit is land conversion. We're taking away forests, we're taking away trees, and we're doing that for a large part to grow food. And the way we're growing food really, really impacts our soil health. So whereas many indigenous communities and groups around the world really think about the whole integrity of an ecosystem, industrialized agriculture really thinks about just getting the biggest amount of yield at whatever cost, sadly. And so what that means is we're depleting our soils of nutrients. We're applying a lot of synthetic things that could be provided through biological alternatives. So for an example, synthetic nitrogen. We're putting a lot of that on the world's soils in the name of industrial agriculture. About 50% of that is going away. It's either becoming a pollutant called nitrous oxide, which is 300 times more potent a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. It's going into our waterways. And ultimately, this really complex and beautiful relationship between the living organisms that make soil alive, habitable for things that we grow, our own health is declining in a large part. But the positive thing is, that's one approach to agriculture. There are other approaches that have been around for thousands of years and that are being renewed and analyzed and augmented with innovation in the name of regenerative agriculture, agroecological approaches. And there what we're seeing is a real focus on building back soil health, building back biodiversity. So when we start to tweak things like using biological inputs, keeping the ground covered, maybe that's with cover crops, growing lots of things together, not just one thing, we start to see the condition of our soil health, the amount of biodiversity, and even the amount of water and the ability to withstand these really consequential weather events that are increasing because of climate change. We see it all start to turn in the other direction. So soil is almost like the canary in the coal mine if we're pursuing agriculture in a way that's really detrimental for climate and humanity, or an incredible solution to the climate challenge we have to get ourselves out of.
Sara, or maybe Danielle, I wonder if you could just draw that link between living soils, healthy soils, and then soil loss and erosion. How is it that a living soil prevents that? Or,
Yeah, so I'd say that one of the main ways that soil is alive, one of the ways that you keep it healthy, is that you have living roots in there. And so roots being able, like plants growing on there, are able to hold the soil together to prevent erosion. Adding this organic matter to soil also is like a really good way to continue to store carbon, to continue to store nitrogen, to make those nutrients available to plants. And so really, again, sort of what Gerardo said, treating the soil like family, really nurturing it and ensuring that the living part of it is taken care of, helps to ensure that it stays there and we can continue to work with it moving forward.
You mentioned nitrous oxide, also carbon. I started out with that statistic on how much carbon there is in soil. There's a lot. This is Climate Week. What role does soil health have to play in limiting greenhouse gas emissions? Want to take that on?
Sure. Yeah, not only limiting greenhouse gas emissions, but also removing CO2 from the atmosphere, right? So it's both. And we have to be pursuing both of these in tandem, both limiting emissions and drawing down CO2, right? And so soil's gotten a lot of attention in the last 5 or 10 years because it is this huge amount, this huge stock of carbon in the earth. And there's been a lot of hype and a lot of deserved attention around, well, if we can increase the stock of this carbon in soil, then we can draw down a lot of CO2 and offset emissions. There is a lot of potential here. The biophysical potential is about 5 gigatons of CO2 per year. It's about 25% of all of the natural climate solution potential rests in soil. So there's a lot of potential here. And at the same time, soils are also as Sara mentioned, the largest emitter of nitrous oxide, or N2O. And so when we can limit the amount of N2O emissions that are coming from soil, and one of the best ways to do that is to limit synthetic fertilizer inputs, then that is one of the biggest levers that we have to reduce emissions, particularly from agricultural systems. And as soils are becoming healthier, they're able to supply more nutrients, more nitrogen for plants, and allows for the reduction in these synthetic fertilizers, right? So it's both of these things together, drawing down CO2, but also reducing emissions that I think are really the climate linkage with healthy soils.
And maybe to add the adaptation side, because I think the climate space, we're talking about mitigation, climate justice, and another incredibly important dimension of this whole conversation globally, and then adaptation. And I think the adaptation side is so extraordinary. I mean, you can think of when soil's alive more like a sponge. So if you have a really kind of capable sponge, you can get a lot of moisture in it and it's gonna hold it. And what happens is our soils degrade when the rain is coming more powerfully, like these deluges. We're experiencing them in New York, we experience them in Kenya, in the monsoon season. These precipitation events are getting more dramatic. So more water is falling more quickly. And so if you have soil that has a holding capacity that can retain that water, it's a very different experience for the ability of the crop, the plant, the food you're trying to grow, dying, being washed away, or withstanding this event. And that's where we're seeing the difference in regenerative agriculture with a real focus on soil health. About 70% of the samples we've seen where we're using good soil health practices for regenerative ag are withstanding extreme water precipitation events differently. And that becomes an economic cost, where one model in the Midwest looked at the cost of crop failure just with focus on soil health, living roots, and it's a decrease in payouts for lost crop of 25%. And that's significant. Those are taxpayer dollars. Those are livelihoods for farmers, all because of this adaptation capability that comes from soil health and the climate resilience and water retention dimension that comes from that.
So the climate resilience that can come from soil health, that's really interesting. Is it also right to think about soil health as something that's threatened by climate change, by more extreme precipitation, by rising temperatures? How can that impact soil health, drive soil loss?
You know, I would say that we talk about soil health like it's something separate from our own health a lot of the time, but really and truly our health is dependent on the health of the soil in the areas that we live. And I think that with climate change, we're seeing, as Sara mentioned, more extreme weather events. We're seeing more instances of drought. We're seeing greater sort of fluctuations in, yield on croplands, and that represents a massive additional risk to farmers. Healthy soils and, a large expenditure for farmers is, again, nitrogen fertilizer. So thinking about how does healthy soil help to provide those nutrients? How does healthy soil help to balance the impacts to those farmers of climate change? I think, honestly, how does it help to improve our own health? I think the nitrogen issue is a major one. I think there's a lot of health impacts that come from nitrates that are entering the groundwater. There's a lot of climate change impacts that come from N2O entering the atmosphere. And so healthy soil is able to help attenuate those issues quite a bit.
If I could just give a farmer perspective, which is a lot more blunt, and just so you know. But our perspective is a little bit different. Like, we believe that soil is the only solution, because with a healthy soil system, you're looking at a diverse array of production, because you can't just have a healthy soil and just grow corn, right? There's no production value within the soil if you're just growing corn. So like in order to have a healthy soil, you have to think about the water that's coming onto your farm. You have to think about any sort of production that can protect yourself. Not only in terms of like the soil microbiology and like growing that, but also in terms of like any type of climate instance that would happen. So like on our farm, and most of the farms that we represent around the world, they're not just growing one thing, right? Their revenue streams are diversified. That way it's protected. So if our honey goes out, which happened to us this year because our neighbors sprayed for mosquitoes, which kills 80 hives in one day, I didn't, not that I didn't care, because that's upsetting, but like I didn't impact my revenue, right? Like I could have a healthy enough soil that I was like, okay, that's all right. Like we'll just ramp up produce production and find something that has a quicker return. So like at the end of the day, like the way our farmers see it is that like there's no way that we can mitigate climate with energy solutions unless it's some magical like nuclear energy that doesn't have waste. We even believe we're most of them are pretty against solar as well, because there's a life limit on that. There is no life limit on a healthy soil. You can continually build it and build it and build it and build it, and it will just become more and more and more and more and more productive. We've seen it like throughout history before humans in the Midwest, in the Serengeti, like there's 9 feet deep of topsoil for a reason, because it was just kept getting build and build and build and build. So like for us, we see the solution for climate change is our producers, right? Like the land is getting lost, but we don't want it to be lost to industrial concrete, kind of like where we are right now. But like we want it to be a building block that constantly improves.
Yeah, it strikes me when you're talking about soil as in soil health as a sort of foundation. If you're thinking about that, you can't help but think about all of the other interconnections and things that are behind soil health. I just wanted to come back to this question of carbon sequestration in soil and some of the open questions and uncertainties related to that. I know there are questions about how durably soil can store carbon, how to monitor that, how to verify that. Don't want to go too far into that, but maybe you could address some of those sort of open questions that still are out there as far as soil as a reliable carbon sequestration strategy.
Yeah, I mean, and these are important questions, right? Because if we're going to invest in incentives or policies that are meant to sequester soil carbon, we want to make sure that's paying off. And so one challenge comes down to accounting. How do we measure changes, right? Soil is heterogeneous, meaning it can be different not only from one region to another, but from one field to another, right? And so sometimes the monitoring that it takes to verify changes can be difficult, but I think there's a lot of progress being made in ways of doing that. But one of the most, I'd say one of the criticisms that has come up most acutely has been around the durability. That is, okay, well, if we increase carbon in soils, but then later on it gets lost, or have we really done anything to mitigate climate change? And I want to make a couple of points about this. One is that what we need to do is pull out enough CO2 that it gets us through this energy transition and decarbonization over the next few decades, right? And if in 40 or 50 years, some of that CO2 begins to be released from soil, I think that's okay if we can get through the middle part of this century. The other thing is that as a natural ecosystem, as part of a natural ecosystem, carbon is always going to be coming in and out of these systems, right? Carbon in soil is not just sitting there like it's in a bank account. The carbon is really, it's representing the fuel for all of the energy, for all of the life that's in soil, right? And so all of the things that soil organisms do, the cycling of nutrients that supplies nitrogen, the building of soil structure that is responsible for that water holding capacity, all of this requires energy, and it's going to require some level of using that carbon. And so there's going to be some dynamic element to it. That is, there's going to be carbon coming in and out, but the goal is that on the net is an increase and a net sort of stabilization of soil carbon, right? And this is not that different from putting forests, from afforestation, right? From thinking about carbon sequestered above ground. That carbon can also be at risk of loss from wildfires that can destroy forests. But at the end of the day, right, what we get from increasing soil carbon is not just offsetting emissions and pulling down CO2, but it's these incredible co-benefits, reductions in risk for farmers, water, nitrogen benefits, and also feedbacks to actually yields and crop production. Some of our work, some of other folks' work have shown that actually, as you increase soil carbon, there's a direct feedback to crop yields, such that as soil carbon goes up, so do crop yields, right? So this is part of this positive feedback, right? So yes, there are concerns, and many of these concerns are not unique to soil carbon, but are part of any natural climate solution. But I would argue that the multiple benefits that we get really outweigh some of these concerns.
Danielle, in the green room, you were talking about how even in, I don't know, the past 10 years, you've sort of seen a real shift where carbon used to be the sort of last thing on the list of when people talked about all the benefits of soil, and now it's the first thing and maybe even sort of dominates the rest. So we talked about soil carbon. Can you talk about some of the other things that soil does for us and for ecosystems?
No, absolutely. And I think one of the main things to think about is that when you talk about soil organic matter is really the important concept there. It's not just carbon, it's nitrogen and it's phosphorus. It's all of these elements that plants need in order to grow. And so when we increase soil organic matter, we're also increasing the capacity of soil to store all of these various nutrients that become useful over time. There are so many things that soils are able to do. You mentioned water holding capacity, drawing CO2 down from the atmosphere, filtering water before it's able to enter groundwater, surface water bodies. And really, a lot of soil's ability to do these things is dependent on the soil biological community, soil biodiversity, as well as the way in which we manage it. And so managing farms regeneratively, as you mentioned, whatever the definition for that turns out to be, eventually, is really thinking about what are we putting onto the soil? What do the crops need? How much of what we are putting on is making it to the crop? How much does that cost? How much is it costing farmers? What are the economic impacts of that? How much are we taking off, right? How do we balance nitrogen, which I'll keep talking about? How do we balance nitrogen inputs and outputs? How do we balance how much carbon is coming in and coming out? And really, I think that gets at the focus of like, how does soil continue to provide all of these benefits?
The last 5 minutes, I just want to go around the horn and get an answer from each of you as far as what is the biggest thing that we can do now to improve soil health, from policy changes, new technology, reforms to farming. What do you see as the biggest step? Maybe, Sarah, you could start.
Yeah, I do think this, though it is a term with many definitions, we've actually, through a big network that Rockefeller has been supporting called Regen 10, we've now documented over 150 definitions of regenerative. So that you don't need to define it, guys. It's been defined many times. What needs to happen, though, is we need to create a harmonized definition that brings all the brilliance around those many instruments and measurement approaches. And actually, that is what Regen 10 has been trying to do, analyzing all of those 150 with a group of farmers, indigenous communities, business, and science. So there's a very heterogeneous table to say, okay, pulling all that together, what is this? What can it be? And how does it first and foremost serve producers? What do producers want this thing called regenerative to do? And if I were to summarize this construct of regen ag to then offer an answer to your question, I think you could summarize all those definitions to say it is rooted in principles like ecological function, reciprocity. It is measured through outcomes, one of which predominantly is soil health, but applied through really specific practices that make sense for what you're growing, who's growing it, where they're growing it, the rainfall in that place. So it's more than just a couple practices. It could be a lot of outcomes or it could be just a couple. But I think what we need to see for the future of soil health is a very prominent focus that whatever incarnation of regenerative you want to bring to your place, your community, let the outcome of soil health be something you're measuring and critically incentivizing through policy and finance.
It comes back to your earlier point about soil health being the foundation and how you can't talk about that without talking about everything. Danielle, what's your number one?
I'd say, honestly, the investments made in sustainable agriculture by the IRA have been actually quite helpful so far. I think we had a report come out by E2 that highlighted that there are both economic benefits to rural communities because of these investments, as well as driving farmers to invest in these sustainable techniques. I think one of the things moving forward that we need to look at is to look at soil a little bit more holistically. Carbon's super important. How does soil help us tackle the nitrogen crisis that we're facing right now with all of these impacts on human health, biodiversity, climate change, everything like that? soil can do all of these things for us. How do we invest in ways to move farmers away from needing to add so many inputs and allowing the soil to do what it can do, which is help farmers supply those inputs and, build agricultural resilience, like in the face of climate change?
Cool. Gerardo.
Yeah, I love the way Food Tank does these. They're so professional. I'm here to ruin that today, but it depends on how passionate I get over this answer. For us at Gala, we proclaim the proclamation of regenerative agriculture, what it does for us, and really at the end of it, like Sara said, there's like a million definitions out there. So we proclaim that regenerative agriculture is the fact that we are Latino. It's within our culture to grow food. It's within our culture to cultivate the land, but also like make it more prosperous, and profitable as well. But also in terms of like as part of our family, we want it to live forever, right? Because I want my grandkid's grandkid to take over the farm. So like when I go around these things, and it's really difficult as a farmer to walk around these rooms, just so you know. One, because nobody ever talks to me unless they see my hat. But we kind of see like all these policies and regulations and scientists, no offense guys, like really talking about managing farms, but nobody's ever had dirt underneath their nails, right? You don't know what it's like to like sweat in climate change, right? This is concrete protecting you from what it's like out in the field. So like when we look at it as like a possible solution to this, we kind of look at it as a different way at Gala. We want people to proclaim and not chastise, but like warn people that they're being grown conventionally. It'd be very different if you went to the grocery store and bread said grown with Roundup. Would you buy it? Right? No. The fact that our producers have to proclaim and showcase that they're growing things the way nature intended is absolutely ridiculous. And the fact that anybody even accepts like an organic certification or regen ag certification, that's like insane to us, right? Like, yeah. So, as a Latino, we make up 80% of the workforce in agriculture in the United States, 70% of construction. If you look at food as a whole, Latinos are the ones feeding you. And if you look at the food service industry, it's even higher percentage. So like when I come here and I'm the only brown guy that farms, it's absolutely ridiculous to see that anyone's going to even enact any change, right? I'd love to see more voice of the farmer here, more farmers, more workers. And they can spike the change. They're not dumb. They know how to change the system. That stamp of like grown with Roundup, that's from a farmer. That's not from me. So that's my thing.
Tim, you want to finish this out?
Thank you, Gerardo. Yeah. Farmers like you know how to farm, and you know how to farm well. You know how to farm to protect soil health. And what we hear time and time again is that what farmers need to do that, they need land, they need markets, and they need to not be squeezed on both sides by buyers and by input suppliers. So I'm going to step us back. We need antitrust legislation to get at the extreme consolidation in the agricultural industry on both sides. We need land reform. We can't have land be a vehicle for real estate speculation, right? That's going to keep farmers off the land, right? And we need markets that value the labor of farmers and that value diversity of crops and products, whether that's this public procurement, things like farm to school programs, farm to prison, farm to hospital, right? And I think I couldn't sum it up any better than Gerardo in the sense that it's recognizing that the system that we have right now took a tremendous amount of investment and a coordinated policy effort over a century to create this system, and it's working exactly like it intended to. So undoing this is going to be acting boldly and thinking boldly, and I think thinking beyond just changes in practices on an individual farm and farmer level. That's important, but we have to be thinking about this whole system and how we got here to begin with.
I like the scientists.
I think that's all we have time for. A good place to stop. Thank you all so much. Thanks.